In addition to skeletal muscle, there is also cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. We'll talk about cardiac muscle even more when we talk about the cardiovascular system and we talk about the heart. But we'll go ahead and introduce some key features here. So first of all, cardiac muscle tissue is only located in the heart, and its main function is to pump blood through the circulatory system. So the heart itself is able to pump blood through blood vessels all the way down to your big toe and back up to the heart, and all the way to the top of your head and back down to the heart. So it's got a pretty important job, and it's all centralized, the pumping is all centralized in the heart. Now, if we were to look at cardiac muscle tissue underneath a microscope, it looks similar to skeletal muscle tissue in some ways, but it does have differences as well. It does have striations or stripes, just like the skeletal muscle did. It's hard to see on the picture here, but they would be faint stripes going in this direction. The striations are due to the proteins actin and myosin. So those are the same contractile proteins that you learned about in skeletal muscle. And those proteins are arranged in sarcomeres just like skeletal muscle tissue is. One key difference between cardiac muscle cells and skeletal muscle cells is that cardiac muscle cells are branching. So skeletal muscle cells just make long cylinders, whereas you can see these cells are kind of branching off and making connections with more than one other cell. This helps the communication between cells because all of the cells in the heart need to be able to contract together at the same time in order to work together to push blood through the circulatory system. So this branching ensures that if this cell gets the signal to contract, that information can quickly spread to all the cells that it's attached to. So that branching just increases which cells or how many cells are communicating with which other cells. There are also these specialized structures called intercalated discs. And once again, it's kind of hard to see on the picture, but we can see one right there. So that dark, it looks like a dark striation, but that's actually a connection between two cells. So this is one cell here, this is a different cell, and this is a connection between their cell membranes. And these intercalated discs actually have these little gaps in them. They're called gap junctions. And these gap junctions allow the cytoplasm from one cardiac muscle cell to be shared with the adjacent cell very quickly. So that also increases the ability for these cells to work together, because if this cell gets the signal to contract, that information can travel through those gap junctions into the adjacent cell and make it contract as well. Now let's talk about smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue is located in the walls of hollow organs and passageways in your body. So think about the tubes in your body. So primarily the digestive tract. So your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines are all they all have smooth muscle tissue in the walls of the organs. Also the respiratory tract, so the trachea and the bronchi have smooth muscle in them. The urinary tract, so the urinary bladder, urethra, and ureters all have smooth muscle in the walls of those structures. And also the reproductive system, especially in women, the uterus and the vagina also have smooth muscle tissue in the walls of those structures. And the smooth muscle tissue helps to control the movement of materials through those organs. So, for example, as material moves through your intestines, it's the smooth muscle tissue in the walls of those organs that are helping to basically squeeze that material through your intestines in one direction. It's also the smooth muscle in the uterus that contracts in order to push a baby out of the uterus during childbirth. Now, if we look at the cells underneath a microscope, they do not have striations. So here, we'll go back to this picture here. So we're seeing the muscle, or yeah, the smooth muscle cells are running in this direction here, but they don't have those striations that we see in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And that's actually one reason why it's called smooth muscle, is because it looks smoother. The individual cells are spindle shaped, so they kind of look like a flattened football. And the cells do have some actin and myosin, but it's not as abundant. So we don't have the striations because they're not jam-packed full of actin and myosin. But you can see here that there's a network of actin and myosin that are attached to these things called dense bodies. So the actin and myosin can still contract, and it pulls a dense body towards another dense body. So when it contracts, it actually makes the cell it gets shorter but fatter. So we can actually take a look at this picture here. So we've got the dense bodies, and it's got those filaments, actin and myosin, in between. So when these filaments contract, and it just happens the same way like skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, where the myosin and the actin slide over each other, it pulls those dense bodies closer to each other, and it causes the muscle fiber to become shorter, but it also kind of fattens it out a little bit. Now, smooth muscle contractions are also regulated. In skeletal muscle, we talked about troponin and tropomyosin as the regulatory proteins. In smooth muscle, the regulatory protein is called calmodulin. So calmodulin. And just like with skeletal muscle cells, calcium is the ion that removes that inhibition. So in skeletal muscle, calcium bound to troponin, which moved tropomyosin away from the binding sites on actin. So in smooth muscle, calcium binds to calmodulin in order to allow the actin and myosin to interact and contract. And that calcium, some of it comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, just like in skeletal muscle cells, but some of it also comes from the extracellular fluid. All right, so when that calcium binds to the calmodulin, it activates an enzyme that allows myosin heads to bind to actin. The myosin slide over actin, pulling the dense bodies closer together, and then you get your muscle contraction. Now, the type of contraction that we see in smooth muscle tissue is called peristalsis. So if you see the word peristalsis, you should immediately think smooth muscle tissue. So peristalsis are rhythmic contractions that help move material in one direction. So that's the key here. So think about material like poop moving through your intestines. You want to make sure that that material is moving in one direction and leaving your body out through the end it's supposed to move. If we didn't have smooth muscle tissue, that material would just sit there, or it might even get pushed in the wrong direction. So I think of this as kind of like milking a cow, or if you're trying to get like the last little bit of toothpaste out of a tube of toothpaste, you start at one end and you kind of squeeze the toothpaste towards the open end. And that's what peristalsis looks like. And I have a video here which is not going to play. Let me see if I can get that to play.